Hello. Well, um, it's been a week and a half, I guess, since the last one, and I've had this ready for you for a couple days, but I have not been able to fit it in, and it's been excruciatingly painful not to teach you this lesson. It's the second part of last week's lesson, so if you haven't listened to last week's, listen to that one first, and then come to this one. Although we'll review, I think it would be best for you to listen to last week's, okay? First. The second thing, if you read the email, you know that you were supposed to bring pair of scissors, scotch tape, and your papers. Okay, and the reason is we're going to have a spreadsheet. That spreadsheet is going to help you to read what we studied last week on the three passages where Jesus prophesies his death, and he calls his disciples, and calls them to servanthood or discipleship. Both mean the same. So, and we're going to look at it contextually so that you see that Mark builds upon former stories, and you should never extract a story out of Mark and teach it as though it had no before and no after, because in Mark, he loves to set up things chiastically or with inclusios. And you need to be able to see these things so that you read what he has to say correctly. Context rules. I can remember Kay Arthur, oh my goodness, 25 years ago when I took her courses and started teaching her way. Before I went away to seminary, she said, context is king. Context rules. You must see a passage in its context in order to get what it's really saying. And of course, we want to see what it's really saying before we even try, even glimpse, even taste a little bit of what it's saying to us. What is God saying, period, in this passage and its context? When you're all done that, when I'm all done my Bible study, preparing, reading the text over and over again, finding out what it is saying, going to my commentaries to see what wise men who are scholars are saying about it, men who have much more time than I have. And when I'm all done that, then I start thinking about, now how does this apply to my peoples and my life? Okay? Good. Context rules? Got it. Okay, so what we're going to do is take our papers, and the paper that has a number 1 at the head of its column, and it doesn't have another column next to it, you are going to fold in half, like this. Then you're going to take your scissors, like I am, and cut along the fold line. Okay, so I am cutting along the fold line, because you want number 1 to be number 1. First thing we look at. Okay? So, the other half, check it. Get rid of it. Okay? The next page you're going to look at has a 2 at the top and a 6 at the top. Fold it in half so you have a straight line. Take your scissors and cut that one in half. Okay, so we have cotton. Boy, doesn't this feel like kindergarten? Yeah, we love it, don't we? You're going to be using your Scotch tape next, because you're going to take page 1 or column 1 and column 2, and you're going to put them next to each other so that the 1 is first and the 2 is second. And you're going to take a piece of Scotch tape or 2 pieces of Scotch tape. In fact, I would recommend at least 2. And Scotch tape those 2 together. So I'm taking 1 and I'm going with a nice long one, 2. And now our 1 and our 2 are next to each other. See that? That's column 1, column 2. Put this column 6 aside for a minute, and then you have 3-columned page. And it says 3, 4, 5. That's 3rd, 4th, and 5th columns. Don't have to cut that. Don't cut it. Put the 3 next to the 2. Okay? So that you have 2, 3, 4, 5. Get your Scotch tape. Now, if you were in my class, we would be doing this together. And Scotch tape 2 next to 3. Got it? See? So now we have columns 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And we still have a 6th. Take that 6th column. Put it next to the 5th column. And guess what? Scotch tape it again. Okay? Now you're going to want to keep this paper so that you can teach it. Because all you need to have to be a good teacher is a pointer finger. Point them to the scriptures. Point them to the text. Point them to this. And all you have to do is talk to them like I talk to you. Now I know you think that I'm really smart. I am not. The only reason I know more than you know is because I read the text over and over and over and over and over and over and over, and I keep on reading it over. Especially if I've taught it before, and I have taught this before. So I wanted to get a new glimpse of it from scratch, and so I started reading it over and over again. Then I went to commentary, and if you want a commentary on Mark, I think I've just asked me, and I'll give you the name of some good commentaries. So now we have from 1 to 6. Okay. Now the first column, and you can use colored pencils, and I would suggest you use colored pencils for the words that are the same in each column. So we're going to look at the very beginning of Mark in verse 16. After he has taught, the author of Mark starts out with John the Baptist, a prophecy concerning John the Baptist and the Messiah from Isaiah. And after John the Baptist has baptized Jesus, and Jesus has gone into the wilderness and was tempted 40 days and 40 nights, then we have this story about discipleship and the apostles being called. I'm going to tell you what the discipleship words are so that you can circle them. Now you can either circle them each in a different color, because we will see all of them later in today's lesson. Okay? So as Jesus was going along by the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and Andrew, the brother of Simon, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And Jesus said to them, "Get behind me, and I will make you become fishers of men." Immediately they left their nets and followed him. So the words "get behind me" and "followed him" are 2 different Greek words. Sometimes in our English translation, we translate the words "get behind me" as "follow me." But it's really a different word. It is a synonym of "follow me," but it's a different word. So I want you to see this differently as two different words. So going on a little farther, he saw James, the son of Zebedee, and John, his brother, who were also in the boat mending the nets. Immediately he called them. There's another discipleship word, called. So do that with a different color or a pen, just like all of them. It doesn't matter. And they left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired servants, and they went away to get behind him. There it is again. Okay, so these right from the get-go, we are talking about Jesus who is calling his disciples to discipleship. Now we're going to understand what that word discipleship is later on in this lesson, because discipleship is no less than servanthood, and we're going to see that. Okay, so that was column 1. Now column 2 is much further on in our story. If you remember last week when we did this, we saw the 3 passages concerning Jesus' prophecy. That is column 3, column 4, column 5. But we did not look at the context of those 3 columns. We just extracted them. Now we're going to see that there's an inclusio, a story that makes an inclusio around those 3 passages. And this inclusio is going to tell us why the disciples don't get it. Remember, in each case, they didn't get it. Peter yells at Jesus, gets right in Jesus' face. He's not behind Jesus, is he? He's not following Jesus. He's in Jesus' face, isn't he? The next column, they were discussing who's the greatest. Now, he's just told them what discipleship meant. It meant to serve one another. And yet they don't get it. And in the 3rd column, James and John want to sit on the right hand and the left hand of Jesus, don't they? They're not getting it. And we're going to see in the passage before and the passage after these 3 columns why they're not getting it. Okay, so let's look at column 2. And they came to Bethlehem, and they brought a blind man to Jesus and implored him to touch him. Taking the blind man by the hand, he brought him out of the village. Okay, I want you to circle blind. Would you? Blind. This man is blind. And after spitting on his eyes and laying his hands on him, he asked him, "Do you see anything?" Here's a man who has eyes, but he's blind. He can't see. And he looked up and said, "I see men, for I see them like trees." There's another word you ought to be circling, the word see. Do you see anything? Yes, I see men like trees walking around. Then again, Jesus laid his hands on this man's eyes, and he looked intently and was restored. He could see. He began to see everything clearly. And he sent him to his home, saying, "Do not even enter the village." So he takes him out of the village, does this privately, and tells him to go home, and he does well. So here we have a man, and it's such an odd story. This story plagued me for decades. I know. Yes, there are things that plague me for decades that I don't get for years. And then all of a sudden, because I've learned the context more, because I've read more, of the word, all of a sudden I realize what's going on here. This man wants to be able to see, but he can't because he's blind. When Jesus takes the spit in his hands and puts his hands there on him, the man can see, but everything looks a little fuzzy. And then Jesus puts his hands again on the man, and then he can see clearly, can't he? What's going on here? Well, what's going on is those three passages that follow it. They see, but they don't yet see clearly, do they? His disciples don't get it. This story pictures Jesus's disciples. And the thing in Mark is that word, being able to see, is to understand. Let's just look at that in chapter 8. Chapter 8 in Mark, and see what I mean. Chapter 8, about the disciples. They ain't getting it. Chapter 8 in Mark and verse 18. They are 18. Okay. They're on the boat. They've forgotten bread. So they only have one loaf. Now Jesus has just previously made enough bread for 5,000 people and 4,000 people, 2 different times. And they're squabbling about the fact that they don't have bread when he's trying to teach them something. And so he says this in verse 18 about them. Having eyes, Jesus says to them, do you not see? And having ears, do you not hear? You're not seeing, you're not hearing, are you? And then he says in verse 21, and he was saying to them, do you not yet understand? See, they have eyes, they don't see. They're not understanding. They're not getting it. And so the very next story is about the blind man who kind of sees, only it's very fuzzy, just like with the disciples. See what the author is doing? Now, what we're going to do is to show you the inclusio around the 3 stories of servanthood, is look at the story after the 3 passages. So the story before the 3 passages is about a blind man who sees partially, and then Jesus clears it up. And now that column 6, let's go with column 6 and let's read it. Another story immediately after the 3rd prophecy of Jesus. Then they came to Jericho, and as he was leaving Jericho with his disciples and a large crowd, a blind beggar named Bartimaeus, the son of Timaeus, was sitting on the way. When he heard that it was Jesus the Nazarene, he began to cry out and say, Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me. Halt, halt, right there. Nobody has called Jesus son of David except this man who's blind. He's saying that Jesus is the Messiah. He's calling Jesus the son of David, which is what the prophets called the future Messiah, the son of David. And here's a blind man who's getting it, isn't he? Verse 49, and Jesus stopped and said, call him here. Do you remember that word? Call him here? That's from the first column. Remember? It says, said to them, he called them in verse 20 in the first column. I should have had this paper marked. I have the other one marked. Okay, now he's calling this blind man, isn't he? Saying to call him here. So they called the blind man. Ooh, same word. Saying to him, take courage, stand up. He is calling for you. Is Mark impressing this word upon you? He's calling this blind man to himself as a disciple. Let's see. Throwing aside his cloak. Ooh, isn't that like Peter, James, John, Andrew? They left behind. They left things behind. Here he's leaving his cloak behind. Throwing aside his cloak, he jumped up and came to Jesus. And answering him, Jesus said, what do you want me to do for you? And the blind man said to him, Rabboni, I want to regain my sight. Now that's exactly what the disciples should have said, isn't it? They should have asked Jesus for sight because they were lacking sight. They were lacking understanding. They did not get it. But he knows, I want to regain my sight. And Jesus said to him, go, your faith has saved you. Immediately, he regained his sight and began following him on the way. It gives us hope for these disciples, doesn't it? When the blind man in column 2 did not have sight, but then got a hazy sight, and Jesus and only Jesus could give them sight. And now this blind man has no sight. It had to be Jesus to give him sight. And when we in the past had no sight, we really didn't get it about Jesus, did we? And it was Jesus who gave us sight, isn't it? Okay, so we got the inclusio, don't we? 2 stories about blind men. Immediately before the 3 passages and immediately following the 3 passages. Now I'm going to say a little bit more about column 6, but after we review what those 3 columns are like, how they are alike, because this is important. How they are like. And I know we went over it last week, but it bears reminding. I have gone over this story and taught this story innumerable times. And every time I come to it, I find something new. So never get tired of hearing the story again and again and again and again and again. Because there's new things every time. So we have Jesus traveling, but we don't quite know where he's going. We know where he is, Caesarea Philippi in the first, and in Galilee in the second. But it isn't until we get to the 3rd column that we find out that he is going to Jerusalem. And we know that because each of these columns has the words on the way, don't they? On the way. And so they're going on the way to where? On the way to Jerusalem. So the first column, Jesus was given a prophecy about the horrors of what he's going to face as the Son of Man. He's going to face rejection. Then they're going to kill him. But then he's going to rise on the 3rd day. Man, oh man, he doesn't say this just one time. He says it in that first column. In the second column, he gives a prophecy where he says, I'm going to rise again in 3 days. And in the third column, he's going to say, I'm going to rise on the 3rd day. Whoa, they should have gotten it, shouldn't they? And he was stating it plainly, but Peter didn't get it, did he? He started arguing with Jesus, didn't he? And notice what Jesus says in verse 33. After Peter gets in Jesus' face and rebukes him, what does Jesus do? But turning around and seeing his disciples, he knows that they're hearing Peter and they're listening to Peter, and he does not want them to think Peter is right to do this. So he says, he rebuked Peter. I want you to answer this question 3 times. Who did he rebuke? Peter. Who did he rebuke? Peter. Who did he rebuke? Peter. Now it's important because we get this story so messed up because we're not watching the words. Okay? He rebuked Peter. And in that rebuke, he calls Peter a name. Do you know what name that was? He calls him Satan. But he's rebuking Peter and calling Peter Satan. But he's saying words to Peter. And what words does he say? Listen very carefully. Watch this. He says, "Get behind me." Wait a second. You've heard those words before. In fact, 2 times in one passage. Go back to the first column. And it says in verse 17, and Jesus said to them, "Get behind me." And then in verse 20 at the very end, they went away to get behind him. So he's saying, Simon, and why is he calling him Satan? Why is he calling him Satan when he's talking to Peter, rebuking Peter? He calls him Satan because he is doing what Satan does. And that is, he has his mind not on God's interests, but on man's interests. That's what it says in verse 33. He says, you're just like Satan. But he's talking to Peter and saying, okay, Peter, you're right in my face. Get where you belong. Get behind me, Satan. See? All makes sense now, doesn't it? Yes, it does. And then he calls them and other people, calls them to himself, and he talks about servanthood. You know, deny yourself, take up your cross, follow me. Where'd you see that word? First column, first story about discipleship. They followed him. See that in verse 18. They followed him. Second column. We've talked about this already. They're going through Galilee. Where are they going? On the way. We saw that mentioned 2 times in this story. We saw that mentioned in, let's see, 8:27. On the way in verse 28:27, they're on the way, and he's and then in the column that we're on now, column 4, he teaches them on the way, and it says that 2 times in verse 33 and 34. What were you discussing? On the way. But they kept silent, for on the way they had discussed with one another who's the greatest. Oh my, they don't get it. So he sits down again. I think the second time I might have raised my voice. I did have a habit of speaking more sternly if I had to say something a second time. Now, I was not a yeller. I did not like yelling, and so I strived very hard not to yell. But I did speak firmly. And I wonder if Jesus did, or if he was much more patient than I. And he says, if anyone wants to be first, he shall be last of all, servant of all. And we talked about this last week, and none of us want to be last. None of us want to be slave to all. Nope, we did not. No. So, well, now we have servanthood described again. At first it says, deny yourself, take up your cross, follow him. And now it adds, be last, be slave to all. Yes. Now what's he trying to prove? He gives the prophetic word. I'm going to be brutally used, hurt. Then I'm going to be killed. Then I'm going to rise again. You see, Jesus' suffering and death is attached to his words about servanthood. Each time he talks about his prophecy, he talks about servanthood to his disciples. Why? Because he was the epitome of servanthood. How? By dying, by suffering, dying, and rising again. He was the ultimate servant who suffered and died. And they were to follow him. And why were they to follow him? Not just in where he walked, but in his actions. They were to be servants, like Jesus was a servant to all. Then we have column 5. And notice what happens in column 5. He does the same things, but watch this. In column 5, in verse 32, they were on the way, finally told us, yes, to Jerusalem. What was going to happen in Jerusalem? He's going to die. He's going to suffer and die. And Jesus was doing what? Walking on ahead of them. They were behind him. They were following him. See? He was going to go first and do first what he expected of them in the future. He suffered. They were going to suffer. He went first. And they were amazed, and those who followed were fearful. Here they're following, but they're already afraid. They're going to get so scared that they're going to stop following him, aren't they? And that's in the garden. And again, he took the 12 aside and began to tell them, and he gives his prophecy, doesn't he? Only this time, it's much more extensive. He's going to tell them minutely what's going to happen to him. Listen to it. He began to tell them what was going to happen to him, saying, behold, we are going up to Jerusalem. That means up a mountain. And the Son of Man will be delivered to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and will hand him over to the Gentiles. They will mock him and spit on him and scourge him and kill him. And 3 days later, he will rise again. Wow. That's a description, isn't it? I think I would have turned back at that point if I was Jesus. But thank God I'm not Jesus. Jesus is the ultimate servant, willing to do this first, and we must follow. James and John came up to Jesus saying, Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you. And he said to them, what do you want me to do for you? Wait a second. We heard those words before, didn't we? I'll just wait. We're going to hear them again in the 6th column. But Jesus says these words to James and John. What do you want me to do for you? And they said to him, grant that we may sit one on your right and one on your left in your glory. Oh, man. Calling them to himself, Jesus said to them, whoever wishes to become great among you will be your servant, your slave. And whoever wishes to be first among you will be slave of all. Oh my goodness. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve. See, he's the servant of all, serving all, and to give his life a ransom for many. What a beautiful thing. So 3 times he calls them to servanthood, discipleship. What did that mean? It meant deny yourself, take up your cross, follow Jesus, be last, be slave to all, be slave to all. How does all this compare with what the disciples expected? They expected that Jesus shouldn't die. They expected that one of them would be greatest. They expected that 2 of them would sit on either side of Jesus in his glory. They expected Jesus to come into his glory soon, where they would be powerful men in his kingdom, didn't they? But they didn't realize that Jesus' suffering and death is all about servanthood, and they were called to servanthood, not to high positions. So let's now go to the 6th column and see it in a different way. Then they came to Jesus, and as he was at Jericho, and as they were leaving Jericho with his disciples and a large crowd, a blind beggar named Bartimaeus, the son of Timaeus, was sitting on the way. When he heard that it was Jesus, the Nazarene, he began to cry out and say, "Jesus, son of David." Oh, he gets it, not like the other disciples. "Have mercy on me." And Jesus stopped and said, "Call him here." So they called the blind man, saying to him, "Take courage, stand up. He is calling for you." Throwing aside his cloak, he jumped up and came to Jesus. And answering the blind man, Jesus said, "What do you want me to do for you?" The same question he gave James and John, the sons of Zebedee. Wait a second. He's asking a blind man what he wants him to do? And listen to what the blind man says. Then the blind man said to him, "Rabboni, I want to regain my sight." And Jesus said to him, "Go, your faith has saved you." Immediately he regained his sight and began following him on the way. So he is a part of the multitudes that Jesus goes through when he comes down the Mount of Olives. Remember, the next place that Jesus goes is to the Mount of Olives, where he's going to enter into Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives like a king. And this man will be there, praising God. I'm sure that he never took his sight for granted. I wonder how much we take for granted. We do. Our health, perhaps, that we live in a house or a condo or an apartment, that we have enough food, even though there's been problems with getting food. It's not been that bad. We still have food in the marketplace. And we take it all for granted and worry about the stupidest things, don't we? So let's stop worrying about ourselves and let's be servant to all, saying no to ourselves and yes to others, because Jesus did it first, and we're called to follow him. We're called to get behind him and to follow him. And since he did it first, that's why we should. Okay? I hope you enjoyed seeing these 3 prophetic passages in their 3 columns in context. Well, see you next week. I do love you. Bye-bye.